Hello and many thanks for joining us on this edition of People, Politics and Power. I am Imonia Marere. We turn our attention to the United Nations. As the world gathers for the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, the spotlight is once again turning to the only truly universal forum for international diplomacy and dialogue. Nearly 8 decades after its founding, the UN faces both a test of resilience and a reaffirmation of its purpose. From the wars in Europe, the Middle East, and in Africa to the climate crisis, debt distress, widening inequality, and the resurgence of authoritarianism, the challenges before the nations are as complex as they are urgent. Critics argue that the United Nations is struggling under the weight of outdated structures and political divisions, while others insist that no other institution holds the legitimacy and reach to force global consensus. The 80th United Nations General Assembly, therefore, comes not only as a meeting of world leaders, but as a mirror of the international order itself, asking whether the United Nations can still rise above geopolitics to advance peace, security, and sustainable development in a fractured world. At 80, is the United Nations still relevant in a world it was created to save? Will it remain the guardian of peace or just the echo chamber of a divided world? Or will it just talk while the world burns? Well, on this edition of the program, we have assembled a panel of experts and seasoned diplomats to do a deep dive into the issues that are at stake and the matters that are arising. We'll get to meet them very soon, but first, let's take this report on the United Nations General Assembly at 80.
The United Nations Organization, a post-World War II creation and a succeeding institution to the now-defunct League of Nations, will dominate global headlines as the 80th UN General Assembly kicks off this month. The 2025 Unga comes at a time of increased global tensions, deepened by unending conflicts which have taken hundreds of thousands of lives in various parts of the world. In Europe, in the Middle East, and in Africa, a common thread runs through, which is war, deaths, hunger, and an unimaginable human suffering. In Africa, political crisis and extremism have spiraled into deadly outcomes from DR Congo to Ethiopia and from Somalia to Sudan. The armed conflict in Sudan, often described as a forgotten war, which began in April 2023, has so far displaced over 13 million people, with tens of thousands of deaths. It has also been described as the world's largest humanitarian crisis. UNICEF estimates that 15 million children are in dire need of humanitarian assistance. The UN has since raised the alarm for a severe food crisis, breakdown of health services, and widespread human rights violations. So what has the UN done? It has passed Security Council resolutions calling for ceasefire, established an independent human rights council to investigate violations, and is coordinating humanitarian efforts. In all, the UN seal appears helpless to stop the carnage, with Secretary General Antonio Guterres pleading for the world not to turn its back on Sudan. The tragedy is that while Sudan bleeds, the rest of the world seems to have moved on. Grabbing and sustaining the international headlines instead are the conflict in Gaza and the Ukraine-Russia war. Gaza is now a field of rubble as Israel intensifies its assault, which it says is targeted at Hamas. The collateral damage has been scary. Palestine Health Ministry estimates that 63,000 Gazans have been killed directly from the war including children and women, while about 145,000 wounded. But the humanitarian crisis is mind-boggling, with the Gaza Health Ministry reporting thousands of hunger-related deaths, evoking global concerns. On June 4, 2025, the UN Security Council failed to pass a resolution for unconditional ceasefire after it was vetoed by the United States. 8 days later, on June 12, the General Assembly adopted the ceasefire resolution by an overwhelming majority of 149, with 12 against and 19 abstaining. But it has had little effect as the killings continue.
This draft resolution had a simple goal: demanding a ceasefire that would allow the beginning of the monumental work needed to end the horrific humanitarian situation, to stop the genocide, to release hostages and prisoners, and to get the Israeli occupying forces out of Gaza before they get a chance to implement their plans to destroy our people.
The war in Gaza is therefore expected to be a dominant issue of the 2025 high-level debate. But it could also mark a turning point in Western stance towards the conflict, with the United Kingdom, France, Australia, Canada, Malta, and Belgium announcing they will recognize Palestine as a state at the General Assembly. Interestingly, the host of the conference and Israel's staunchest ally, the United States, has reportedly imposed visa restrictions on everyone holding a Palestinian passport, including Gazans, according to the New York Times.
We thank the United States for standing on the right side, for standing on the side of truth, justice, and moral clarity. Thank you for refusing to abandon the hostages and for refusing to legitimize the lies of this resolution.
The Russia-Ukraine conflict may also serve up fresh verbal exchanges at the 2025 Unga. Since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February 2022, hostilities have continued unabated, again exposing the failure of world leaders and the United Nations. Other highlights of the 80th session of the General Assembly will include sustainable development targets of addressing world poverty, health, water, sanitation, and illiteracy, which many countries are already falling behind, with 5 years to the target year. New national action plans on climate change are also expected to be adopted. So while the world prepares for a debate, the outcome may, as usual, have little or no impact on the millions dying each day and the billions whose existence are under threat.
Great, that report sets the stage for our discussion of the UN General Assembly, the 80th meeting of the United Nations General Assembly, which in fact is on as we speak. And I'm joined in the studio by Ambassador Usman Sarki. He is a retired career diplomat, former deputy permanent representative of Nigeria to the United Nations in New York. He served at different times in Australia, Saudi Arabia, Switzerland, that is in Geneva, and currently he is a directing staff of the National Institute for Policy and Strategic Studies in Kuru, where he lectures on diplomacy and public policy. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure seeing you.
Also joining us virtually is Professor Mukhtar Imam. Professor Imam is a professor of international relations and a directing staff at the National Institute for Security Studies. Professor Imam, thank you so much for finding time to join us. I hope
My pleasure. Good afternoon.
Great to have you, Professor Imam. Right, so, Ambassador, let's begin this way.
Thank you.
The 80th edition of the UN General Assembly. I'm sure that somewhere along the line, many people around the world may not have thought that the UN will last as long as it has. done so far. 8 decades
Yes.
into its existence.
Yes.
What do you think is being the sustaining power?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for having me on this program. And also, just to make a point of correction, I left NIPS as directing staff in 2022. So, but I still lecture there when I'm given the opportunity. So you are not entirely wrong. I'm still associated with that, that venerable institution. Well, your question is very profound in terms of the relevance and continuity of the United Nations after 8 years of survival. What makes it going is that simply there is no other alternative to the United Nations. No other framework or arrangement has been devised or conceived by humanity to provide a platform, a common platform for the discussion of challenges confronting the world. Nobody has proposed any other arrangement to take the place of the United Nations. And because of that, there is this attachment of member states to that organization as the only alternative available to the filtration, articulation, and expression of opinion of members. So in the absence of an alternative, the United Nations will continue to exist until and unless the powers that be, that is, the members of the Security Council, the 5 permanent members, and other member states decide to really terminate the arrangement. And we don't see any possibility or the likelihood of such an eventuality coming to pass, because the United Nations is there to stay. It is relevant, it is important, especially for the collection of member states, 193 members, that find expression of their desires and also concerns and worries about global governance, about global challenges, and also about opportunities to be leveraged towards the maintenance of international peace, security, sustainable development, promotion of human rights, and so forth. So we'll still see the relevance of the United Nations for many more decades to come.
Professor Imam, talking about the relevance of the United Nations, when it was set up 8 decades ago, it was expected to be an international forum, a true universal forum for international diplomacy and dialogue. But that doesn't appear to have played out so far in the 8 decades of its continued existence. Many think that the United Nations General Assembly is simply now a talk shop. Well, we appear to have lost the signals from Professor Imam, but Ambassador, let me pose that question to you.
Yes.
You have just said that there is no alternative.
Yes.
There has not been an alternative in the 8 decades that the UN has existed as a forum for diplomacy and international dialogue. But there are those who think that it has lost its bite and that it's just now a debating chamber, a shadow of what it was conceived to be.
Quite so. Even internally in the United Nations itself, in the 1990s, there have been discussions about the relevance of the organization, about the renewal and rejuvenation of the organization. And when our own Secretary General, late Kofi Annan, assumed the leadership of the organization, he introduced some internal changes into the organization by establishing what is called a system-wide coherence towards rejuvenating the United Nations. And along the line, he produced a document called In Larger Freedom to express the concerns that you have now voiced in terms of the relevance of the United Nations, to reassess the position of the United Nations in terms of its activities, its posture, and the implementation of its charter. And because of that, issues like the Millennium Project in 2000 was adopted by member states at the proposition of Kofi Annan towards really creating momentum in terms of the direction in which the United Nations will go from 2000. And because of that, the Millennium Development Agenda, MDGs, were established in 2000. And then following that, we have the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, 15 years later in 2015. And this continued to really bring the United Nations closer to the people, and also to give vent and expression to the concerns and worries of countries about the relevance of the United Nations. Now, in terms of what I see as if the United Nations has lost its bite, as you say, well, I think the United Nations is as good as its member states. It is the member states that establish the agenda, establish the priority, and the work program for the United Nations. The Secretariat of the organization only manifests and implements the decisions of the member states. So wherever the United Nations is seen to fail or to have failed, it is not a fault of the organizations per se, but really the incapacity and inadequacy of the member states, especially the big powers, that use the United Nations as a platform for projection of their power and interests, and not reflecting the collectivity of the desire of mankind. And that is where the dichotomy between aspirations and reality happen in the United Nations.
So, Prof, we're happy to have you back on. You just heard the ambassador say that, look, the United Nations as an organization is as good as the members or those who make up the organization want it to be. Does it appear to you, for instance, that the members are beginning to lose faith and interest in the ability and capability of the United Nations to carry out those objectives that it gave to itself 80 years ago when it was set up? For instance, is it still able to resolve conflicts such as those that we now have in Ukraine, in Gaza, in the Sudan, in the DR Congo, and many other parts of the world?
Thank you very much. And good afternoon to my uncle and most amiable leader, Ambassador Osman Serki, seated in the studio. First of all, let me congratulate the world for having stood together as a United Nations for about 8 decades now. It is something worthy of commendation, regardless of the obstacles and setbacks. In the words of Doug's Hammonds Joad, he said that the search for peace has its successes and setbacks. However, that quest cannot be abandoned, and that the day we stop searching for peace, that's the day humanity as we know it ceases to exist. So therefore, I think it is worthy to commend the world for that. However, to your question, I think the United Nations essentially is, of course, as has been mentioned by Ambassador Osman Serki, is a United Nations. And so it is expected that those who constitute membership of that organization heed and throw their weight behind resolutions that are made within that establishment. The primacy, remember, for which the United Nations was established is to ensure that never again, that we never see a world war, that we never see genocide, that we never see whatever, that threatens global peace. But here we are. At a time where the world needs multilateralism, at a time where the world needs coming together, we're beginning to see multilateralism wane. We're beginning to see ultra-nationalist figures and values take the center stage. We're beginning to see that the world is nearer to a third world war than it has ever been in its history, largely because some of the reasons, in my view, that led to the First World War, and of course the First World War caused the Second World War, are essentially still very prevalent here with us. Ebullient militarism, for example, aggressive nationalism, for example, which again can be attributed to the ultra-nationalist views of certain individuals. Insatiable imperialism, for example. So the truth of the matter is, from where I sit, I think world leaders are beginning to exhibit certain traits that goes contrary to the views of the people whom they govern all around the world. And I think this is most dominant in the activities and the actions of global superpowers. World wars, which you spoke about, for example, the world is facing a war fatigue. Yet we see that actions that can be taken by certain governments, uh, specifically the United States, for example, to bring an end to certain confrontations and conflicts around the world. Say, for example, the ongoing genocide in Palestine. Say, for example, the actions of NATO that led to and has continued to lead to what we're witnessing between Russia and Ukraine, has essentially dragged the world into a much more deeper crisis situation and an unstable situation. And so, therefore, while this might not be blamed entirely on the United Nations, because again, like we said, it's a United Nations. It's a conglomerate of countries coming together to say we will submit to certain global consensus and we will ensure that an international order, a rule-based order, will be adhered to. Yet, those same liberal or neoliberal elements who set in motion these international values and orders are the ones trumping these same values. And so we see the world being enmeshed in crisis and conflict all over. So therefore, I think it is largely the responsibility of these countries to ensure that they do the needful. And when we speak about countries, a distinction must be made between the sub and superstructure. What we see playing out in most cases, for example, in the case of the United States, you see the paradox. In the case of the genocide ongoing in Palestine, for example, the people out on the street, as a matter of fact, if anything has given a change or a shift to the dynamics, to the attention that the world is currently giving to the Palestinian issue. It is the actions and effort of students on campus in the United States and across Europe, which stands in direct contrast to what the leadership of these environments are doing, specifically the United States. And so that goes to tell you that what the leadership does at the United Nations or does not do at the United Nations is not necessarily reflective of the substructure. So we see this contradiction, we see this paradox playing itself out, and hence a lot of people will tell you how these are the reasons why we find democratic reversals around the world, because people find that it is as a result of the so-called democratic values or entrenching what they see as democracy that we find ourselves in this quagmire. So the long and short of what I'm trying to say is this: that governments, particularly those in the global north, must ensure that if there is a rule-based order, if there is an international body, all protocols within that establishment has to be respected. More so, the institutions, the Secretariat of the United Nations need to begin to do more. It is not enough. It doesn't absorb them completely. It is not enough to say we are just the United Nations, we are just the Secretariat, hence whatever happens around the world, we fold our arms and watch. If you cannot carry out the responsibility, you step aside for those who can carry out that responsibility.
So, Ambassador, critics have argued, for example, that the UN has been strongly struggling under the weight of outdated structures and political divisions. And it's as a result of that you have seen in the 80 years of its existence, you have seen a number of wars. Indeed, you have seen a number of genocides being committed, whether in Bosnia, whether in Rwanda, and now in Gaza. And the UN, as it were, each time has been unable to stop, or has, in fact, made resolutions that were observed in mindless breach.
Quite so. Let me thank Professor Imam for articulating a number of very important issues regarding the operations of the United Nations and the principles behind actually the establishment of the organization, which we see today are being blatantly breached, like you notice, by powerful countries that actually should set the example in terms of observance and upholding of the Charter. Now, the idea of international peace and security, the respect and promotion of human rights, and promotion of sustainable development are the three pillars on which the United Nations is predicated. All these three, concurrently, if they are pursued, they are meant to really prevent wars, conflicts, and bring harmony among civilizations, amongst people and nations. But unfortunately, because of expediency of politics and the drive and pursuit of vested interests by powerful countries, these pillars, these principles and objectives and aspirations of the United Nations are sometimes observed more, in fact, in the breach than rather the implementation. So the outdated structures that you refer to should first and foremost be noted that it is the configuration of the organization itself in terms of having a Security Council that is skewed in favor of only 5 powerful countries. That is the greatest impediment to the globalization and success of the United Nations itself. In principle, it is a global organization. In practice, it is everywhere. But in terms of control and power dynamics, it is not a global institution. It is an institution controlled by 5 countries that have the veto power in the Security Council. So it is this anachronistic arrangement, this outdated arrangement that needs to be changed, reconfigured, and revitalized in terms of democratization of the institution, involvement of other players, particularly regional leaders like Nigeria, in Africa and in other regions, and also creating inclusivity, not necessarily in terms of military might or economic might, but in terms of cultural and persuasive configuration and disposition of countries. In that way, the idea of unification of civilization can happen instead of conflict of civilization. And also in terms of cooperative endeavor to bring about peace can now be translated into reality. And I think the pronouncement by the president of China, Xi Jinping, recently at the organization of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting at Tianjin, SCO, last week, he called emphatically for a new global governance order, a new global governance initiative. And he really deprecated the present militarization of the multilateral system, the go-alone attitude adopted by some countries, and the lack of cooperation and collaboration among important countries to address issues like Ukraine and Gaza. All these things, I think, impel or propel him to call for a review of the existing order and to bring about a new global governance initiative that will be inclusive, that will be more humane, and that will actually take on board the concerns and considerations of all countries, where power does not be the sole determinant of what happens and what should not happen. So I agree with you that there are anachronisms in the UN today, and countries like Nigeria should be more assertive in terms of pointing out these pitfalls into which the United Nations have fallen, and to really, within the African continent, to generate conversation towards having a unified position, not only on who should become the permanent member of the United Nations from the African continent, but to set the agenda of conversation in terms of the holistic and total reform of the organization.
Now talking about having to build a new structure, and in fact, with reference to resolutions and even the founding objectives of the organization, one of which we must quickly look at and set aside. The fact that the UN headquarters is located in the United States and in New York. And for this 80th General Assembly, the United States is denying certain countries and certain
delegations and leaders,
political leaders, access to that, headquarters and to the General Assembly. which was one of the things that was one of the tenets that was laid down in 1945 when the organization was founded.
Yeah.
How is that likely to continue to shape or determine the debate about whether or not the headquarters of the UN should remain in New York, for instance?
Well, actually, you know, this stance, that posture by the United States government, the current government, had taken, has really galvanized the world, global opinion, on the breach of the fundamental principles of the establishment of the United Nations, and also breach of what is called the headquarters agreement between the United States and the United Nations. And because of that, there are proposals now to shift the General Assembly this year to Geneva and possibly to look for another permanent location for the organization, because the United States can no longer be trusted to be neutral. It can no longer be trusted to play a fair game and to be a referee and to provide the safety and security to all delegations without exception, even when they are ideologically opposed to each other. They should allow such delegations, such candidates, such leaders to come. I remember when President Hugo Chavez was president of Venezuela, he came to New York. On the podium of the General Assembly, he denounced a certain world leader from a country in which actually the United Nations was located. That country did not prevent him from coming. We remember several years past, decades, when Fidel Castro, despite the differences, very, very serious animosity between Cuba and America, Fidel Castro was allowed to come to address the United Nations. Nobody said he should not come, or any other leader with whom there are diametrically opposed contradictions between his country and the United States. But today we have seen a totally radical departure from the established principle and practice of neutrality in terms of the operations of the United Nations. We have seen a breach of the Charter, we have seen a breach of the headquarters agreement, and that should call for further reflection among not only some member states, but all member states of the United Nations, including the rich countries who can afford to provide alternative arrangements for the United Nations to be relocated elsewhere. In the absence of its full relocation, the General Assembly, which is an annual event, the high level, which is just lasting for about a week or 2 weeks, should be held in different countries. Rotationally. I think that is the best proposal. You can hold it in Brasilia this year. You can hold it in Buenos Aires the next year. You can hold it in Canberra. You can hold it in Tokyo. You can hold it in Addis Ababa or Nairobi or Abuja. I think, you know, there should be an innovative thinking to spread the impact of the UN and also to make it possible that no country can arbitrarily, unilaterally decide to prevent or bar other delegations from attending. The African Union can provide an example. We hold the summit, the heads of state and government meeting alternately in Addis Ababa and another location twice every year. And that should give an example to the United Nations so that we can now remove the high-level General Assembly meeting from New York and hold it rotationally according to regional arrangements. I think that will be the most pragmatic and best arrangement that we can propose.
Professor Imam, do you think that's a viable alternative? Indeed, recent happenings have clearly shown how fractured the world is, and of course, the fact that geopolitics appear to have overturned the original principles and objectives of the United Nations. Do you think that a rotational high-level General Assembly is something that should be considered?
Absolutely. I 100% agree with the position of His Excellency. there is the need for an absolute overhaul. There's a need for a complete retrofitting and a reform of the governance architecture of the United Nations. And what Ambassador has just talked about is a model that the United Nations can essentially adopt, or one of the models that the United Nations can essentially adopt to ensure that the process of governance within that institution is democratized. Because without properly democratizing it, and I mean, ensuring the workability of some of these frameworks within that institution, we're going to continually find that the inequitable distribution of resources within the international system will continue. And these, by the way, were some of the things that His Excellency Ambassador himself, Ambassador Professor Gambari, these were some of the things that they fought for. I recall vividly when we're having conversations at the university level, we at one point set up an engagement, a dialogue to converse around the need to restructure the United Nations Security Council in particular. And in the forefront of that conversation were some of the efforts made by His Excellency Ambassador Osman Serki and Ambassador Gambari during their period at the United Nations. And this is where the conversation still is, years after. And so there's a need for that to happen, and very urgently so. The reason why is because, like Ambassador rightly pointed out, we're beginning to see, I mean, we're witnessing regime change, administration after another in the United States, that is the host of the United Nations. And recall, these were some of the points made by the late Muammar Gaddafi, that you will have monopoly of power. And as we say in political science, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So there's a need for the management and administration and leadership of the United Nations to champion, to be in the forefront of the vanguard of the campaign for this change, for this reform to happen. And of course, that also has to be supported by member states. Today, what we were seeing that Trump, for example, is threatening to pull out of the WHO by January of 2026. And where you find this is, I mean, this is a body that is supposed to ensure that there is equitable distributions. Say, for example, let's pick one framework, the PABS agreement, the pathogen access and equality distribution framework, which the United Nations is trying to ensure happens, so that where there's in the event of a pandemic, the world will have access, equal access to vaccinations, etc. Trump is today pulling out of that organization by start of January of 2026. What then becomes the fate of that organization? What is the faith of that organization? What is the faith of the rest of the world? Recall that this is the country that has the highest number of the biggest pharmaceuticals around the world within its territory. So where we see this happen, we will continue to see a monopolistic approach to whatever we do within the international system, and it shouldn't be so. That should not be accepted. So I totally concur to the position of His Excellency that there's a need to ensure that there's a rotation. At least that is the model to start with, to prove to the rest of the world that there's a democratization process going on within that very august body.
Do you see the rest of the world, the other member states of the United Nations, summoning the courage to do just that?
Well, I think it's high time we begin to do so, because courage is something that we have to find. The world belongs to all of us. We are witnessing what is happening with the trade war, inequality and imbalance in trade and so on and so forth. Even the WTO has been, well, awkwardly silent in all of this. So, I mean, this is a time where the world needs to galvanize itself. This is a time where the world needs to speak in unison, particularly the 50 plus country on the African continent. We need to speak with a single voice on that platform to ensure that a certain position is adopted. The courage might not be there now for obvious reasons. There is the internationalization of the US dollar. The petrodollar has essentially taken over virtually almost all economies. The oligarchic international financial structure which we currently run today, these are some of the subtle factors that could essentially, handicap some part of the world from aligning with that position. However, whether you do that or not, the United States, or at least under the leadership of President Trump, will continue to bully the rest of the world. So what you do is do what Lula da Silva has done: stand up to a bully and ensure that you demand for what is rightfully yours. Because, like I said, the world belongs to all of us. So there needs to be some level of equity, some level of respect for one another, and that has to start with demanding that the United Nations activities and programs are, shared around the world to ensure some kind of adequate proportionality, so that where one country hosts the General Assembly, like Ambassador said, another country can step in and do the same a year later. I think that way the world feels some kind of ease.
Ambassador, let's look forward now to what is likely to happen at this high-level General Assembly and thereafter. One of the original principles of the United Nations was to ensure that there is preventive diplomacy to tackle crises, wars, and what have you before they escalate. Do you see a situation where that can be strengthened moving forward?
Yes, but before then, I think one of the principles that the United Nations was established to achieve was the idea of self-determination of peoples and nations. And here, the issue of the Palestinian state, the recognition of Palestine, will be on top of the agenda. And I think it was in anticipation of such a development that the Trump administration decided to bar the Palestinian leadership from participating in that in the forthcoming Congress.
Well, it cannot stop that, especially if the UN General Assembly is moved to Geneva.
Exactly, and that is what other countries are proposing. And even if they don't go, the principle adopted by many countries to recognize Palestine can be expressed, even in the absence of the Palestinian delegation.
And on U.S. soil.
On U.S. soil. And I think, what they have done has backfired in terms of trying to mentally coerce other countries to really, delay such a proposition. However, now here we are coming to the anachronistic arrangement of the United Nations. Even if the General Assembly unanimously passes a resolution recognizing Palestine, it cannot be admitted into the United Nations because of the veto power in the Security Council that will be exercised by the United States of America. So here, I think, another arrangement has to be found whereby member states, when such a resolution is adopted at the General Assembly, will now insist on actually granting independence to Palestine as a state along the 1967 borders with its capital in East Jerusalem. To insist on that, whether it should happen now or later, it is a principle that has been emphatically established under international law. And that should now make countries like America and Israel to realize that the game is up and there is nothing they can do about it. It's a fact that must be established. Now, to come to the idea of prevention of conflicts, that is one of the ideals of the United Nations. And the opening statement, we the people, actually gathered and deciding to prevent the happening of the Second World War. That is the principle of establishing the United Nations. So mechanisms for prevention are there. The political department of the United Nations, the peacekeeping department of the United Nations, the office of the Secretary General itself are offering the structural conveniences to member states to afford themselves of those positions in order to advance the idea of negotiation, the idea of peaceful resolution of disputes. And here, Nigeria can lead the rest of Africa and the world. We agreed under General President Obasanjo's time to actually bring Nigeria into a negotiation mode with Cameroon, supervised by the United Nations under Kofi Annan, under the Green Tree Agreement, to exchange territories and settle our territorial differences peacefully and amicably. in a good neighborly spirit. And I think that has gone down under international law as one of the greatest achievements of the United Nations. Nigerians don't sing about that. The rest of the world recognizes that, but we don't speak about it. So the idea of reconciliation, and also commitment not to use violence or force to settle differences must be the cardinal principle to be to be adopted and reiterated at the 80th anniversary of the United Nations.
Prof, let me quickly bring this up now. We are just 5 years away from 2030. That's when the Sustainable Development Goals are supposed to have been achieved, as it were. Well, do you see a situation where the UN is doing enough to drive a just and inclusive global economic order?
Well, I don't think the UN is doing enough, especially with recent happenings. We're seeing the intensification of the balkanization of the global economy, rather than.
Prof, are you with us? We appear to have lost your audio there, Prof. Hopefully you should get back, but let me direct that to you. Is the United Nations doing enough to drive a just and inclusive economic world order against the backdrop of the SDGs, which 5 years from now, less than 5 years as it were?
Very soon, I think the United Nations will hold a conference on the SDGs to assess the progress of implementation regionally and also at country levels, whereby reports will be submitted to the organization by member states about the steps taken towards the achievement, and to assess the gaps that are still existing in terms of reinforcement of capacity at national levels to discharge governance responsibilities towards achieving the SDGs. But what people don't realize is that parallel to the adoption of the SDGs in 2015, we also negotiated what was called the third conference on financing of development in Addis Ababa. And the fourth conference, I think, took place not long ago in Spain.
In Seville, Spain.
In Seville. And those were machineries actually established in order to provide the necessary funds globally for member states through various mechanisms to really deepen the implementation of the SDGs. So without financings, two critical things cannot be achieved. Number one, sustainable development, and number two, sustainable mitigation of climate change impacts. So I will urge countries like Nigeria to reassess the African position in terms of financing for development and accessing funds for nationally mitigated projects in terms of climate change. And in that way, the remaining 5 years to the end of the SDGs, we can leverage those facilities and bring about meaningful, demonstrable changes in three critical areas. Number one, reducing poverty. Number two, scaling up social programs in health and education especially. And number three, in terms of attending to the impacts of climate change, to really environmentally resuscitate our countries. And I think that will take a global effort. But global efforts must begin at national levels by articulating concerns and opinions and interests, and also exchanging ideas in multilateral process with other countries and institutions in order to place agendas on the table towards their attainment.
How is that likely to be impacted by the shrinking resources that appear to be going to the United Nations, especially from the big powers?
Well, so far,
from the United States, even Europe, they appear to be more concerned about their regional blocs and their national economies than with what goes to the United Nations?
Well, actually, one critical area in which Africa could address this is to really prevent flight of capital from Africa. According to the Thabo Mbeki report, that was, I think, established in, 2015 or 2020, I can't remember exactly, about $300 billion of capital flight is experienced from Africa. Why can't our governments take measures to prevent every year to prevent such flight of capital and then utilize it for the development of our continent? We can also, through this kind of plugging the gaps, especially tax evasion, corruption, and stealing and taking of our capital, and also the physical stealing of Africa's mineral resources. If we can prevent that, we can even contribute more to the United Nations in terms of assessed contributions to really fill the gap of where America and the other countries are failing to provide. We can really take certain measures to demonstrate our capacity to assist the United Nations in terms of globally advancing its projects and programs, particularly in small island states, in LDC countries, landlocked countries, most of which are in Africa. So it is in our interest to really maximize our finances and our economies in order to contribute to the development of this continent without relying on Europe or Asia or America for that matter.
So do you see the United Nations remaining the central platform for global cooperation moving forward in the face of, as it were, more regional blocs, strengthening their capacities and diverting resources to those blocs?
Well, many countries, remember the United Nations is made up of 193 member states. And the great majority of these member states still hold the United Nations in higher esteem. And they would like to see the continuation of this arrangement of the United Nations as a viable global institution that provides the platform for the venting of concerns and interests of member states. So I still see the continuation of the relevance of the United Nations. However, the big countries in the South, in the global South, must come together to express their opinion on how global governance should go. And I think it will be interesting for African countries to have a special moment or platform to discuss the proposition by the Chinese President Xi Jinping on a new global initiative. That should give impetus for reflection and for actually coming to decisions on how to rejuvenate the international system, the United Nations itself, and our own vision of regional governance in Africa.
Professor Imam, we're happy to have you back. Very quickly, in 90 seconds, sum up what your thoughts are as the UNGA goes on in, hopefully, in Geneva?
Right. Well, I hope that the world heals. I hope that world leaders thrive and strive for peace and truly mean it, because from where I'm sitting right now, I don't think they want peace. And I do hope that the conscience of leaders is pricked by the continuous butchery and murder that goes on around the world, particularly in the case of Gaza, and even more profoundly the case of Sudan, because it appears to have been forgotten. And I hope that the conversation leads to something meaningful. And I hope that the 50+ African leaders that are going to be gathered in that room will have a around the need to ensure that the global governance architecture, particularly at the United Nations, is rejigged.
Thank you so much, Professor Mukhtar Imam. He is a professor of international relations and a directing staff at the National Institute for Security Studies. Thank you for your time. And of course, right here in the studio, we had His Excellency Ambassador Usman Serki, the retired career diplomat, former Deputy Permanent Representative of Nigeria at the United Nations in New York, and He also served at different times in Australia, Saudi Arabia, Geneva in Switzerland, and he was also a directing staff at the National Institute for Policy and Strategic Studies, NIPS, in Kuru, at least up until 2022. But of course, at the moment, he's also still sharing his experiences at NIPS, teaching diplomacy and public policy. Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for joining us.
It's a great pleasure.
All right, that's our program for today. Thank you for investing your time with us. We'll see you again when we bring you a fresh edition of People, Politics, and Power. Bye for now.